The rain came down sideways over the airfield the night Eli Marsh found her, 12 years old, barefoot, sitting under the wing of a grounded charter plane like she'd been left there on purpose. He didn't ask her name that night. He just gave her his jacket and let her sleep in the back office of the hangar he swept floors in, and in the morning, when she still hadn't said a word, he made a decision that would take him 15 years to understand the size of. He called her Wren, because that was the bird stitched crooked on her one shoe. Some stories take a while to show you why they matter, this is one of them, so stay close, and if you like where it's headed, subscribing helps more of these find you. Back then, Eli was nobody by design. He'd made sure of it. He hadn't always swept hangar floors. 11 years before that rainy night, Eli Marsh had been the lead propulsion engineer at Holloway Aviation, the man whose signature meant a turbine blade wouldn't fracture at 30,000 feet. He remembered the exact weight of the stamp he used to press into fatigue test reports, remembered the particular blue ink, remembered the last morning he ever touched it. An internal audit had produced a folder with his initials on falsified results, and by that afternoon he was escorted out of a building he'd helped design the safety protocols for. No trial. No hearing. Just a severance check and a name that couldn't get hired in the industry again. He never found out who altered the file. He only knew it wasn't him, and he'd spent 11 years carrying that certainty like a stone in a coat pocket, present in every room he walked into, invisible to everyone else. So he built a smaller life. A bicycle and small engine repair shop in a town where nobody asked about turbines, a daughter he raised on instinct and stubbornness, and hands that still, without him telling them to, checked every bolt twice. Wren grew up in the back room of that shop, doing homework on an overturned toolbox, learning to read gauges before she could read chapter books. She never called him anything but Dad, though she was old enough now, at 17, to understand that wasn't the word on paper. The shop smelled like cut aluminum and coffee gone lukewarm in a thermos he never finished. Eli's hands moved over a jammed derailleur the way another man might move over a piano, unhurried, exact, listening for the click that meant something was seated right. Wren sat cross-legged on the workbench, quizzing herself on a chemistry exam, occasionally glancing at her father's hands like she was still trying to solve a different equation entirely. "You always tighten that side first," she said, not looking up. "Why?" He didn't answer with words. He just showed her, guiding her fingers to the tension point, the way he'd done since she was small enough to sit in his lap at this same bench. It was the only language he trusted completely. Outside, the town went about its ordinary evening, a delivery truck idling, someone's dog barking at nothing, the particular gray light of a coastal dusk settling over the gravel lot. Holloway Aviation's new CEO arrived in town on a Tuesday, in a car too clean for the gravel lot outside Eli's shop, because her fleet's backup charter plane had blown a tire on approach to the regional strip and every real mechanic in 3 counties was already booked. Naomi Holloway didn't introduce herself as the granddaughter of the company's founder, not at first. She introduced herself as someone in a hurry, which was true in more ways than the tire. She watched Eli work with an attention that had nothing to do with rubber and everything to do with the way his eyes moved across the undercarriage like he was reading a language she recognized from somewhere she couldn't place. She had power most people in this town would never touch. She also had a private terror she hadn't told her own board, a diagnosis, 6 months old, of a degenerative condition slowly narrowing the edges of her vision, and a company she wasn't sure she could keep steering once the world started closing in around her. In his jacket pocket, worn thin at the seam, Eli still carried a single bent aluminum rivet, scratched with 2 faint initials that weren't his. He'd carried it for 11 years without knowing exactly why, except that it had come loose in his hand the day everything ended, and something in him had refused to let it go. He never explained it to anyone. Not even Wren. Naomi came back 3 more times that week, each visit stretching a little longer past what the tire repair required. The first time, she told herself it was due diligence, a CEO should know the people servicing her fleet, even indirectly. The second time, she brought coffee for herself and, without quite deciding to, one for him too, setting it on the bench without comment. He drank it without comment back, and something in that small exchange settled between them like the first bolt of a frame going in true. She noticed things. The way he torque-checked a bolt without a gauge and got the number right anyway. The way he glanced instinctively at stress points on her plane's wing that had nothing to do with the tire. The way he flinched, barely, when she mentioned Holloway Aviation's name aloud. She said nothing about it to him. Instead, she drove back to her office that night and pulled old personnel files she had no official reason to be looking at, cross-referencing names against a decade-old internal audit that had always, in some corner of her mind, never quite sat right. Her assistant, a sharp-eyed young analyst named Priya Desai, noticed the late nights and the sealed archive requests routed through her own login. "You're not looking at fleet maintenance," Priya said one evening, setting down a stack of printouts Naomi hadn't asked for but needed anyway. "You're looking at something from before either of us worked here." Naomi didn't deny it. She simply asked Priya, quietly, whether she trusted her enough to keep pulling threads without asking why yet. Priya, who'd spent 2 years watching Voss talk over Naomi in board meetings with a familiarity that had always felt 1 degree too proprietary, said yes without hesitating. Wren noticed too, not the files, but the way her father's shoulders changed whenever the woman's car pulled into the lot. "You know her," Wren said one evening, not a question. Eli kept his eyes on the carburetor in his hands. "I used to work in her family's world," he said, which was true and told her nothing. Wren didn't push. She'd learned long ago that her father's silences were a kind of honesty too, the kind that cost him something to keep. That night, though, she pulled out an old shoebox from under her bed, the single shoe with the crooked bird stitched on it, the only thing she'd had with her the night he found her, and sat with it a long time, thinking about how much of both their pasts lived in things too worn to explain out loud. Naomi's next visit came with a folder tucked under her arm instead of a car problem. She didn't open it. She just watched him work on an engine that had nothing wrong with it that a lesser mechanic couldn't have already fixed, and asked, carefully, whether he'd ever worked on turbines. He said no. His hands, for the first time since she'd met him, went still. That stillness told her more than a confession would have. She drove 3 hours to the state archive the next morning, requesting records the company's own legal team had sealed a decade ago, and found a name buried in a subcontractor list that made her stomach drop, not Eli's name, but the name of the man who'd countersigned the very audit that ended his career, Martin Voss, her father's old COO, the man who still sat 2 seats down from her at every board meeting, offering fatherly advice about which risks the company could and couldn't survive. She sat in the archive parking lot for 20 minutes afterward, not driving anywhere, just staring at a name she trusted since childhood. Priya, digging separately through years-old expense reports at Naomi's quiet request, found something else, a consulting payment, routed through a shell subcontractor, paid out the same month Eli was terminated, to an account that traced, after 3 more days of careful, deniable inquiries, back to Voss's brother-in-law. It wasn't proof of the forgery itself, but it was proof someone had been paid to make a problem disappear quietly, and it gave Naomi a second thread to pull alongside the first. At the shop, in a scene neither adult orchestrated, Wren sat beside Naomi while Eli worked, and said, without any weight in her voice at all, the kind of thing only a child says because she hasn't yet learned to be afraid of the truth: "He still checks the same bolt 3 times, even when it's fine. He says a plane doesn't care if you're tired. I think it's from before I knew him." Naomi didn't ask before what. She didn't need to. She just felt something in her chest tighten the way it did right before a decision she couldn't undo. A second time, weeks later, Wren found Naomi alone by her car after a visit that had run long into evening, both of them quiet in the particular way of people carrying things they hadn't said yet. "He kept a piece of metal in his jacket for as long as I can remember," Wren told her, not because she understood its meaning, only because she'd noticed. "He thinks I don't see him touch it when he's worried." Naomi didn't answer right away. She just nodded, filing it next to everything else she wasn't ready to say aloud. Meanwhile, Priya's quiet digging widened. She pulled shipping manifests from the year of the falsified report, cross-referencing them against maintenance logs from 3 regional airstrips, and found a pattern that had gone unnoticed for over a decade: 2 of the turbine blades from that same flawed batch had never been recalled at all, quietly rotated into a backup charter fleet that flew smaller, less scrutinized routes. It meant the danger Voss had buried wasn't only historical, it was still, potentially, in the air. Priya brought the manifests to Naomi late one night, and for the first time since this had started, Naomi felt the ground shift from a matter of old injustice into a matter of present safety. "We need eyes that actually know these engines," Priya said. "Not auditors. Someone who used to build them." Naomi didn't say Eli's name aloud, but they both understood who she meant. That set the stage for a quieter, third meeting between Eli and Naomi, not about the past this time, but about the 2 aircraft still flying with compromised blades. Eli pored over the maintenance logs at his workbench late into the night, ran asleep in the back room, the shop lit only by a single work lamp. He found what Voss's buried report had never accounted for, a specific vibration signature, subtle enough for an ordinary inspection to miss, that would show up on diagnostic readouts if anyone knew exactly what frequency to isolate. He wrote it out for Naomi in his own hand, the same steady handwriting that used to appear on official Holloway aviation test certificates, and for a moment neither of them mentioned how strange it was that his signature still meant exactly what it used to. The 2 flagged aircraft were quietly grounded within the week under a routine inspection notice, no public alarm raised, no press release issued, just careful, deliberate caution moving faster than the danger had. Priya handled the paperwork. Naomi handled the board's questions about the sudden groundings, giving vague answers about precautionary maintenance, until she had enough evidence to give them the real one. Eli, for the first time in 11 years, stood in an actual hangar bay again, running his hand along a turbine housing he hadn't touched since the world took his name away from him, and said nothing about how it felt, though Naomi, watching from a few feet away, thought she understood anyway. Martin Voss had run Holloway Aviation's operations for 19 years, and for 11 of them, he'd carried a secret with the same quiet confidence he carried his tailored suits, a falsified fatigue test report on a batch of turbine blades that had shown early stress fractures, blades too expensive to recall without getting the company's quarterly numbers. He'd buried the real data, forged the sign-off, and let a promising young engineer named Eli Marsh take the fall when internal audit came sniffing. Voss had built his entire remaining career on top of that lie, and now, watching Naomi's questions grow sharper by the week, he could feel the ground under it shifting. He started making calls of his own, quiet ones, to old contacts, asking who else had been requesting archive access lately, trying to get ahead of a fire he could feel but not yet see. "If you're still with the story here, this is where it starts pulling tight, so hang on a little longer, because what's coming next won't slow down, and following the channel means you won't miss where it lands." Voss's first move was subtle. He suggested, in a private lunch with 2 other board members, that Naomi's judgment had seemed erratic lately, long absences, unexplained archive requests, a distracted air in meetings. He never mentioned her diagnosis directly. He didn't need to. He was laying groundwork, quietly, for a story that would let him discredit whatever she eventually brought forward before she could bring it forward at all. Priya caught wind of the lunch through an assistant's offhand comment and warned Naomi the same afternoon. "He's not waiting to be found out," Priya said. "He's already building his defense." Naomi understood then that she no longer had the luxury of moving slowly. She confronted Voss privately, not with accusations, but with a single document laid flat on his desk, an unredacted lab report, retrieved from an archive he'd assumed no one would ever request. She didn't raise her voice. She simply asked him to explain the discrepancy between what he'd told the board 11 years ago and what the original data actually showed. Voss's composure cracked at the edges, not into confession, but into threat, reminding her whose company this still was, in his mind, and how easily her diagnosis could become a headline about a CEO unfit to lead. Naomi didn't flinch. She'd already decided that whatever her eyes eventually took from her, her judgment wasn't going with it. "I can still read a balance sheet in the dark, Martin," she told him, evenly. "Can you say the same about your conscience?" She went to Eli that night, not with pity, but with the file. She laid it on his workbench between them, next to the derailleur he'd been fixing, and told him what she'd found, the real data, the forged signature, the name that had been buried under his for 11 years. Eli didn't speak for a long moment. He reached into his jacket pocket and set the bent rivet on the bench beside the file. "This came off the test rig the day they walked me out," he said. "I never knew why I kept it." Naomi looked at the initials scratched into the metal, MV, and understood, finally, what her instincts had been circling for weeks. Wren found them there, the file and the rivet between them, like evidence of two different kinds of proof. She didn't cry or make a scene. She just asked, quietly, if this meant her father could stop pretending to be someone smaller than he was. Neither adult answered her directly. But something in the room settled, like a bolt finally seated right. Later that night, alone in her room, Wren finally put words to something she'd carried unspoken for years, that she'd always known, somewhere underneath, that the quiet careful man who raised her had once carried something much heavier than bicycle chains, and that she was proud of him whether or not the world ever found out. The board meeting was called for the following Thursday, ostensibly to review quarterly safety compliance. Voss arrived expecting routine business, flanked by the two board members he'd quietly cultivated over lunches and rounds of golf. Naomi opened with the original fatigue test data, projected without commentary, letting the numbers speak before she said a single word. Then she introduced the falsified report beside it, the discrepancies impossible to explain away as clerical error. She brought forward the subcontractor records tying the forged signature to Voss's authorization codes, timestamps that placed him in the lab the exact week the real data vanished, and finally the shell company payment Priya had traced back to his brother-in-law's account. She never raised her voice once. She simply built the case, plank by plank, the way a good engineer builds a wing, until there was nowhere left for the argument to stand. Voss tried, once, to invoke Naomi's diagnosis as a distraction, suggesting her judgment couldn't be trusted, glancing toward the two board members he'd primed for exactly this moment. But Priya had anticipated it, and quietly circulated a one-page summary of the evidence to every board member that morning, so the room had already read the numbers before Voss ever opened his mouth. Naomi answered without missing a beat that her eyes were narrowing, not her evidence, and asked the board to look at the documents in front of them instead of at her. One by one, the board members Voss had courted looked down at the papers instead of at him. By the time security walked Voss out of the building, it wasn't dramatic. It was procedural, and total, and 11 years too late, but not too late to matter. Eli's name was formally cleared within the month, his old engineering credentials reinstated, the falsified report struck permanently from the company's record. He didn't ask for his old job back. Naomi didn't offer it as charity, she offered him a position redesigning the very fatigue testing protocols that had once destroyed him, because no one alive understood the failure points of that system better than the man who'd been buried by it. Priya, for her part, was named to a new internal compliance role Naomi created specifically because the company needed more people willing to keep pulling threads quietly, long before a crisis forced anyone to. Wren stood in the back of the room the day the board formally reinstated her father's name, watching him shake hands with people who had once let him disappear without a second thought. She thought about the girl who used to sit under a grounded wing in the rain, and how strange it was that the same industry that had once meant nothing to protect her now employed the only two people who ever had. When a junior engineer asked her, politely, what her father used to do before all this, she said only that he'd always known how to check a bolt twice, and let the rest of the answer belong to him. On the evening the papers were finalized, Naomi drove out to the shop one last time, not for a plane and not for a tire. She found Eli exactly where she'd first really seen him, hands still, watching the light fade over the hangar roofline. She didn't say anything about love. She didn't need to. She just sat down on the bench beside him, matched her breathing to the quiet, and after a long moment, held out her hand, palm up. He set the bent rivet into it without a word. She closed her fingers around it and didn't give it back. Wren watched them from the doorway, 17 now and steady in a way that 12-year-old barefoot girl under the wing could never have imagined becoming. She didn't say anything unfiltered this time. She didn't need to. She just leaned against the doorframe and let the quiet hold, the way her father always said a good structure should, not because nothing was pushing against it, but because every piece had finally been checked, and seated, and trusted to hold. Somewhere behind her, propped against the wall where it had sat for years, was the old shoebox with its single crooked bird shoe, and she thought, not for the first time, that some things were worth keeping exactly because they never needed explaining to anyone else. Priya locked up the office behind them that night, glancing once at the two of them walking toward the gravel lot before turning back to her own quiet work, already thinking about the next set of records worth double-checking, because some habits, once learned properly, never really left a person again. The hangar light clicked off behind Eli and Naomi as they walked out together, unhurried, matched pace, into an ordinary evening that had taken 15 years, and one small, bent, scratched aluminum rivet, to finally, quietly arrive. If this one stayed with you, there are more waiting. Subscribe to Velvet Storiez Tales, and let the next story find you when you're ready for it.